Good afternoon, good evening, and warm greetings to all joining us from different parts of the world. So, thank you for being part of this timely discussion under Gas Talk series. Today's webinar's topic is After COP Before 2030 Building a Just Transition Without Gas. I know that most of the colleagues are on leave, but we thought that not to miss the train and initiate this important discussion regarding gas when still COP30 memories are a bit fresh and under discussion. So we have kept this webinar in a meeting mode to enhance the discussion. Hence, please feel free to put your questions and comments in the chat box. And after a speaker's intervention, we will open the floor to take your questions, comments, and feedback. So, friends, we all know that COP30 in Belém represented an important political moment. The adoption of the Belém Action Mechanism and the strengthened commitments on just transition pathways were significant wins for many of us working on climate justice and community-centered transitions. So, congratulations for that. But these outcomes underscored really the global recognition that transitions must be equitable, people focused, and grounded in rights, social protection, and community participation, which is really great. But however, COP30 also left us with a critical gap, which is the absence of a clear, actionable fossil fuel phase out roadmap. So, despite the science, despite escalating climate impact, and despite overwhelming civil society pressure, governments once again stopped short of committing to a concrete timeline or binding obligations for phasing out fossil fuels, particularly fossil gas. And at the same time, gas continues to be aggressively promoted as a transitional solution, even though we know it drives new debt, delays renewable deployment, and deepens insecurity across the global south. But what we observed in the pavilions, at the MDB pavilion, and at several countries' pavilions, that the fossil gas was narrated as a clean fuel, which is really alarming. As we move toward 2030, a decisive period for climate action and energy system transformation, our challenge is really clear. How do we build a just transition without gas in a world where political outcomes still enable fossil expansions? And how do we operationalize the wins of Belém, especially the just transition commitments, in ways that ensure real change on the ground? So, today, our distinguished panel of experts will help unpack these questions through policy, finance, community, and economic lenses. So, let's begin. Today, we are joined by four distinguished speakers. Let me introduce those speakers. Our first speaker is Omar Elmawi from PowerShift Africa. He is a leading energy justice advocate. He and his organization are known globally for the work on renewable energy access, community-centered transition strategies, and campaigns challenging fossil gas expansion in Africa. Our second speaker is Friederike Sturb. She is the climate finance expert at RICOS with experience analyzing development finance flows, IMF, and MDB lending policies and public finance trends in fossil fuel investments. Our third speaker is Annabella Rosenberg from Climate Action Network International. She is a prominent advocate on the just transition work, recognized for her work with social movements and civil society networks shaping equitable, inclusive energy policies. Our fourth speaker is Carola Mejia from Latindad. She is the coordinator for climate justice, transitions, and the Amazon. And she will talk about debt, extractivism, and gas-dependent economies with deep engagement in Latin America and other global South perspectives on gas finance nexus. And our closing remarks will be delivered by Big Shift Global's lead, Sophie Richmond, a long-standing leader in climate justice advocacy, working for fossil fuel phase-out with MDBs. So let's start, and we are starting with you, Umar, coming out of COP30, where we saw progress on the Belém Action Mechanism, but no fossil fuel phase-out roadmap. So what are the biggest risks for energy-poor countries if gas expansion accelerates post-COP30? And what are your observations directly from COP30, where we heard about doubling of energy finance, but largely missing the fossil fuel phase-out roadmap? So over to you, Omar.
Thank you so much, Fiza, for inviting me to join these amazing colleagues within the conversation. And part of me suspects that the three that are coming after me are the experts, right? So Fiza is trying to make sure that I don't miss content to share with you. So I'm sort of cleaning the road for them to come in a bit to speak more about some of the important outcomes that we had from COP and also what those look like for us and this huge fight that we are pushing against fossil fuels. And I'm going to try and condense my sort of intervention into three broad categories, so to speak. I'll begin by trying to, in my own way, sort of pick about COP30 and what that looked like, and then quickly delve into the risks that Fiza just asked me in terms of what are the risks that we are looking at, especially when we are looking at some of the many opportunities that are in the horizon, which could be affected if we move towards a direction of gas. And then in my own also way, I'll try to sort of conclude, and I'll try to do this within the next 8 or so minutes. You'll apologies in advance if I'm going to be too quick to move from one point to the other, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity to discuss further in the Q&A section later. So first and foremost, as far as COP30 is concerned, we went there with a lot of expectations and a lot of hope and a lot of fight in our bodies and in our minds and souls. But the biggest thing that we were taking across the constituency was the fight on just transition, the Just Transition Work Program, or what we all came to know and think as BAM, the Belém Action Mechanism, which I'm sure Annabella is going to speak more about it. And I'm sure all of you know the amazing song that we were singing within the corridors of COP as far as the Belém Action Mechanism is concerned. Now, from all of that, the only thing I would mention is that while that was delivered in terms of the Just Transition Work Program and the Belém Action Mechanism, there was a lot of fight, especially a struggle around pushing for gas as transition fuel within the Just Transition Program. And I will remember I was speaking to one of my colleagues, Kuda Manjonjo, who you all know on the Just Transition work within PowerShift. And he brought it to my knowledge in terms of how several countries, and some of those countries actually being a country like Tanzania, that was really pushing for gas as a transition fuel and pushing against the transition away from fossil fuel that a lot of us were fighting for, if not all of us. So that becomes really important. We get the Just Transition Work Program, still lots and lots of push around utilizing gas as a transition fuel. But at least from where I'm sitting and from my understanding, it's still something that we have to push across because from the continent that I'm coming from, which I'll be speaking about in a bit, gases will not necessarily unlock the continent development or even climate commitment. If anything, it's going to derail us even further to be better as a continent. So that was the only point I wanted to make around COP. COP30 and how it went, and some of my take around the issues. I already told you I'm not the expert, so you will hear more from the experts that are coming after me. So the second bit is really in terms of the risks that we are looking at, between now and 2030 and even beyond, if gas was to play a key role as far as the transition is concerned. Now, if you look at all the different parameters, even if you are Donald Trump, who doesn't believe that climate change is a reality, that it's a hoax, but if you look at it from all other categories as well, gas does not in any way going to improve the energy situation, development situation, not just in Africa, the global south included, and the whole world, so to speak. Whether you look at it from a climate perspective in terms of the carbon emissions that it's going to be emitting every year, whether you look at it from an economic perspective, because we already know that in this case, for instance, in Africa, our renewable energy potential is far much better and greater than the rest of the world. I think close than 40 to 50% of the renewable energy potential is in Africa. If you look at the renewable energy potential that we have, and if we tap into it, Africa has the capacity to provide over 1,000 times of its energy needs in Africa by just tapping into solar and wind, for instance, just by 2030. 1,000 times, more than 1,000 times what we need. So we can actually have enough for the continent and even exporting some of it outside. And then even if you look at the social parameters, the amount of people that have been displaced from gas projects in the African continent and indeed in the global south is really, really significant. Whether you look at the gas situation in Tanzania, where they're trying to now extract it, in Mtwara, whether you look at the situation in Mozambique as far as Cabo Delgado is concerned and the LNG extraction that they want to have. So it's a huge, huge problem socially. And there's a huge amount of communities that are really speaking up against it. So the risk here becomes that gas really does not make sense in all parameters that you look at it. If anything, I'm sure some of us will be asking the question, then why is it still being touted as something that has to be developed within the continent? And your guess is as good as mine. But if I was to guess, I would say that one, it's because renewable energy financing is not accessible to most of our African governments. So they normally will prioritize whichever financing is available. And secondly, whoever is financing the energy within the continent is not necessarily doing it with the interest of supporting the African needs, but actually it's an exploitative mechanism in terms of how do we get this energy from the continent to the global north. And that's why you are seeing huge pipelines being built from Nigeria to Morocco just to get this liquefied gas across to the north. And the same for the gas pipeline that's being built in Tanzania. So it's not being done with the African interest in mind. So for me, a risk is that gas really is not a bridge. And therefore anyone who's saying it's a bridge, for me, it's a dead end in terms of us hitting a wall and getting to a point where we will be having stranded assets because we will be left with an asset with between 20 to 30 years that has to be operational. It's going to be expensive, and by that time, renewables will even be more cheaper. That it's expensive. Renewable energy is definitely cheaper from all the reports that we've looked at, and also won't necessarily provide the energy security or sovereignty that we need to see for the African continent. In my case, where I'm coming from, all of these fossil fuel investments, as well as the gas, is mostly and majorly for export. So. And perhaps this transitions me to the next bit of the point that I wanted to make. And I realize that I have less than 2 minutes to do this. So I'll quickly do them. First is this really becomes very important for us. And it's going to be one of the huge fights that we have, because if we lose the gas fight, I've said it 20, 30 years, that our hands are going to be tied. And we're going to be left with assets that we cannot do anything about them. And we have to ensure that our governments have to live with them for the next 20 or so years. So it's really, really important for us to be more involved and push more on this fight because gas will not in any way improve our situation where less than 5% of our historical emissions. We only are responsible for 5%. That number is going to be higher. It will not definitely provide energy for the 600 million people that are energy poor in Africa because it's mostly for export. It's not necessarily going to provide energy for the close to 1 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking. We know that there are better, cleaner cooking sources, but also because we know that this gas is going to be going out of the continent. And then also, it's not necessarily going to unlock more jobs because we know that renewable energy unlock more jobs compared every megawatt or every barrel of oil or every gas that we extract, whatever equivalent energy equivalent is coming from the fossil fuels, renewable energy will always provide more. And the only way to do this, therefore, is that to make sure that we do these projects and we need grants for them and not loans because it also becomes problematic when we're talking about renewable energy and they're being financed by gas. So finally, just as a way of summing up, I would mention we must definitely at least stop supporting any new gas projects that are being brought to the pipeline and definitely start thinking about how do we transition away from the ones that are already operational. We have to shift financing to renewable energy if indeed we are serious about our climate commitments and the fight for climate action. And this shifting to renewable energy is not just on having the renewable energy projects, but it has to be the whole cycle, including infrastructure that goes towards storage grid and making sure that people have access. And then finally, and this is really important, and unfortunately I didn't mention enough of it, is also the involvement of key people within this conversation, which are communities that are going to be first and foremost affected or benefiting from this project. And then secondly are the workers, people who are actually responsible to making this vision coming into life. So while I'm handing over back to you, Fiza, I would say that for me, just transition without gas is not a sacrifice. For me, it's what I would call is the biggest opportunity. The only question is, do we have the requisite foresight, know-how, and knowledge to see this? Because from everything that I'm hearing, it seems like we don't have the political will from our elected representatives, and therefore we need to make sure that we open the eyes to see why gas is not necessarily the solution or what will provide energy sovereignty. I've been promising that for some time now. So back to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Umar. Thank you. Your analysis of post-COP30 national pathways is really vital as countries navigate energy access alongside climate ambition. And definitely, I agree with you that just transition without gas question, so it is really meaningless. So in the next round of question, we definitely would like to know more about that. How can these regional alliances push for degasification despite global ambiguity at COP30? So now moving towards Frederique. So my question to you, Frederique, that did COP30 change anything in the way MDBs interpret their climate mandates, especially regarding gas? With no global phase out roadmap, are MDBs more likely to continue fossil lending under the guise of transition? So over to you, Frederick.
Thank you so much. And thanks for this great road paving. I have quite a lot of content on the slides, and we'll walk through some of them faster than others. But since we have an hour and a half, I also encourage folks to, if you have questions or you want to circle back to something. I know I can see the participants here are also many of them were at COP themselves or are experts on the MDBs themselves. So I'm assuming that some of it is not news to you, and doesn't bear repeating. But yeah, just let us know, and I think we have enough time to get through everything. So a little bit of context setting. I'm sure many of you have been in, strategy meetings throughout the year, grappling with this sort of crisis of multilateralism that we're facing, in a moment of where really everything is coming down to survival of the fittest and broken trust between global South and North. We are still seeing fossil fuel production expanding, and the NDCs that were delivered before COP left a huge gap in ambition. We are seeing global North countries retreating from their financing obligation despite the advisory opinion of the ICJ, for example. So many of those dynamics we see obviously come up in the COP30 as well. And then one obvious very important piece is that the new finance goal that was set last year was viewed as a betrayal by civil society in the South and shifted the focus around finance on mobilizing instead of providing, which put the MDBs, which are kind of a big piece of the puzzle of this mobilization, right, at the center of the finance discussion. And so as a result of that, having gone, not just to COP this year, but to the G20 in Brazil as well, to the Financing for Development conference in Sevilla this summer, and obviously now to COP, we see that this what scholars have called the Wall Street climate consensus, which is kind of this promotion of de-risking private finance, as the solution, in the context of countries cutting their climate finance and ODA, is kind of permeating all of these spaces, and the kind of solutions that are being discussed, and the space there is inside the negotiations for getting somewhere. And so it's unsurprising that in the process of this, the role of MDBs in climate finance has been growing over the last decade, but kind of in tandem, right, with this shift to this Wall Street climate consensus kind of framing, for which they are one of the number one promoters. And so we supposedly they've been aligned with the Paris Agreement for a couple of years now. We get into that a little bit. But we also have seen this initiative from the G20 pushing for the MDBs to reform over the last couple of years and sort of evolve their mandates. And many of these developments are strings that are coming together, right? So a lot of the finance discussion this year, for example, really built on the G20 that also was hosted by Brazil last year. And so you can see kind of continuities and developments coming, from one into the other, and connections between different multilateral spaces. Right. So I'm sure most of you know that the MDBs have high-level just transition principles, which are not terrible, even talking about affected workers and communities, a gender lens, etc. But they're not operationalized. They don't have like a follow-up structure or anything like that. So right now they're just expressions of a kind of high-level commitment, but there's no way for following up and holding them accountable on that. And there are other aspects of the so-called Paris alignment, right, of the MDBs, both joint principles as well as individual frameworks, and a list of activities that are considered aligned or unaligned. And in that list, you can see there's no mention of oil and gas whatsoever, and a little bit on coal and peat. And so based on that, we are, seeing continued investment in fossil fuels that I'm going to be walking through in the next few slides. So why is it a problem that the MDBs are being pushed more to the center of this architecture? There's kind of 5 reasons for that. One being the MDB climate finance per se. The numbers are likely inflated due to poor accounting, but also most climate finance is in loans and not in grants. So deepening the debt crisis, adding to potential carbon lock-in as well as conditionalities. MDB climate finance doesn't go where it's most needed. Most of it goes to European countries, actually, 3/4 going to mitigation and only 1/4 to adaptation. And once we start looking at the details of the projects themselves, right, even they are sometimes problematic. False solutions, as well as, projects that only have like a minor green element counted as climate finance. And in the context of the COP, it's also a distraction tactic to let rich countries off the hook because it draws attention away from their failure to provide public and grant-based finance as required under the Paris Agreement, by putting the spotlight on mobilizing through the MDBs. Secondly, their idea of or methodology of Paris alignment is also not great. Like I mentioned already, right? Like oil and gas is, for example, not in the list. And as we can see in these charts here, billions of dollars are still flowing into fossil fuels as a result. With the chart on the left looking at all the financing since the Paris Agreement itself was signed, and then the one on the right just over the last couple of years since the MDBs have been supposedly Paris aligned. And so even those projects that they consider aligned are not actually aligned with 1.5 degrees, just with countries' NDCs, which may or may not be like a 1.5 pathway. A lot of money still goes into fossils, as well as, false solutions, large scale projects that are, harming communities like green hydrogen and large scale hydro, etc. So in the context of that, it's problematic that these just transition principles are kind of a paper tiger with no follow-up. And it will be interesting to think about how we can leverage the results of the COP in order to strengthen that framework, in order to avoid, right, that a green transition led and financed by the MDBs means a repetition of exploitative patterns, a deepening of debt, and a creation of new sacrifice zones in the global south. Unsurprisingly, uh, I mean, if we look at MDB climate finance, MDBs, may not have been quote unquote Paris aligned for so long, but they have been in the development space for many decades. And so it's also really important to not just look at what they do on climate specifically, but also what is their wider development model, right? And there we really see this focus on this private finance first agenda and the billions to trillions framework, despite its evident failure over the last decade. And so a lot of this development framework is actually further entrenching global injustice and commodifying nature, putting profit at the center over community interest. And so a lot of that will be translating into the climate space as well. And then last but not least, MDBs also have a long history, right, of conflict with communities and harms, and impacts and lack of informed consent and adequate gender and environmental standards. So strengthening the MDB accountability framework will be really important. And MDB governance is, as we know, undemocratic and usually emissions heavy. Not all MDBs are run by a majority of global North countries, but even then, usually they're skewed towards kind of economic size, which means heavier emissions, which is the opposite of the idea under the UNFCCC of common but differentiated responsibilities. So I'll do a couple of slides of what happened at COP, and then I'll hand back the mic. But I think what we saw on the finance agenda specifically, Anna is here to give you a lot more details on the just transition work, where she really led and is the expert. But I think we saw across negotiation rooms a kind of concerted effort to dilute the obligations of rich countries to provide finance directly. And so two of the sort of processes we've been looking at, one was the so-called Baku to Belém roadmap, which was a presidency-led initiative meant as a tool to basically chart a path after the disappointing NCQG last year towards how can we get to this bigger number of 1.3 trillion. We had a lot of hope for that, right? To actually get some sort of theory of change, some milestones, some more discussion of quality of finance as well. But it was really a continuation of the G20 MDB reform agenda with a big focus on MDB and de-risking. But it also didn't get much traction politically. It kind of died, a sort of quiet death. It didn't die, but given that a lot of work and consultations had gone into it through the year, it was much lower on the kind of visibility agenda than expected. At the same time, the latest report from the high-level panel was published, and even they also, were thinking about how can we reach this 1.3 trillion and envisioning 16 times more private finance, totally unrealistic, versus just 2 times more international public finance. So even there, we see the kind of continuation of this private finance first agenda. And secondly, really important in the context of the fossil question is discussions around Article 2.1c, which are about aligning finance flows with climate resilient development. So we see that as a strategic enabler for finance discussion and to bring in financial architecture reform to the negotiations and into thinking about what is required from the wider architecture in order to implement the Paris Agreement, including finance flows out of fossil fuels, right? Not just we need more climate finance, but also we need finance to go out of the wrong things. And so at COP, it was decided to continue a kind of dialogue format, which before was the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue, now has been renamed to the Veredas dialogue, as well as an annual high-level forum with external stakeholders with like other parts of the financial architecture. So we'll have to see how that goes. We were hoping for something more tangible than that, and something more action-oriented, where we can actually see, guidance and signals coming out of the UNFCCC towards other parts of the financial architecture of what we need from them or what we need them to stop doing. But yeah, it's always a very contentious piece. So that was all that parties were able to agree on. And that's quite unfortunate because I think it was visible that there was a clear frustration from global South countries that the financial architecture is not delivering. Many talked about trade, for example, but we didn't see that kind of political mobilization for an alternative and more transformative vision. I know I'm over time already, so maybe I'll stop here just as a sort of handing over to Annabelle, given that the just transition piece was kind of one of the actual big wins at COP. And I think that can be one of the levers for us to show basically all the ways that the MDB's current approach, based on loans, market-driven, centralized, high-risk projects, etc., is misaligned with what an actual just transition looks like. So hopefully that can be also something we can use in our advocacy. All right, I'll hand it over to Annabella and happy to circle back later.
Thank you, Friederike, and I must thank you a lot for this wonderful work and the presentation you have made. And it has really provide a crucial finance lens on the unfinished business of COP30, I must say. And besides that, thank you very much because I know that it's too early where you are living. So, so thanks a lot for that. So now we are coming towards Annabella and just transition working group and the whole big win. So Anna, COP30 elevated just transition principles but left the fossil question unresolved. So, under this scenario, how can civil society and local communities leverage the Belém outcomes to influence governments toward just energy policies that explicitly move away from fossil fuels? And did COP30 open new political or institutional spaces for community participation? So we would really love to hear your thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Fida, and it's so nice to see so many names that were part of what happened at COP. I mean, like I think it's yeah, we always said this was a collective effort, but this was really a collective effort. I guess your question about how we let's say prevent or how we use a little bit more, how we leverage this conversation we have on just transition to avoid investments going into fossil gas is a really good one. But let's just zoom out for a moment about what is that we're talking about, because I would not like to assume that everyone following MDBs and following the whole fossil finance conversation is the big shift is working on, is actually tracking the just transition discussion. And there are a couple of important elements that somehow explain why CAN and the members, and to a big extent also why many others across other constituencies came together to push on just transition at the COP. And one is that this idea of just transition, that it's a really transformational concept that is coming from social movements, from trade unions, was being increasingly manipulated and weakened by international organizations, as Frederica was saying, and governments. So we were seeing more and more in the past years, in particular since just transition was mentioned in the Paris Agreement, this sort of weakening of the concept. And also, we are all convinced, at least those working on just transition, that if this is put in place, if just transition approaches are deployed and developed well, they can really build that bridge between climate ambition, fossil fuel phase out, and what we do see as an imperative of prosperity, of social justice, of decent jobs that all countries need to realize. So on the one side, a concept with a lot of potential that is being greenwashed, and on the other side, an opportunity being missed of these just transition approaches not being made real on the ground. So based on that diagnosis, we built up a whole 5-year plan last year in the CAN network, but also, again, inspired and supported by our allies. I mean, whether we're talking about the trade unions, the feminist constituency, youth, and different economic and social justice groups as well, with the intention to go with to the COP, at least with a couple of clear needs, and that we didn't know at that point that we could win, that certainly we are going to put a fight. One was to indeed land some principles, some, let's say, safeguards, if we were not calling it that way, so to prevent just transition from being further undermined by international organizations. Say, well, this climate governance space at least is saying that in the context of climate action, this is at least a minimum of elements that need to be covered by just transition. And this is where all the conversations about right holders, like who needs a seat at the table and getting their name and respected, is important. Also, beyond issues of inclusion, the important connection between social prosperity, social justice, and transition, but also anchoring just transition into 1.5 and climate ambition. Because we do know that when the banks, for example, are using just transition, or even when the ILO, with the best intentions, are using just transition, they are not necessarily connecting these to an ambitious climate pathway. So getting that connected in a single decision was an important part of the work. And of course, all the institutional dimensions of advancing a just transition at home, the connection to industrial policy, the connection also to international cooperation, because we know that no country is an island, and there's no way a majority of the countries of the world are going to be able to design a prosperity pathway if in the international distribution of labor, they are still condemned to being commodity exporters and extracting countries. So all of these elements, I think, are now well captured, but it was our demand to have those principles there. A second element was to make just transition policies more financeable, I would say. And what Frederica was saying about the all the fails and ills of MDB financing on climate could be topped up with this extra element of data, which is that only 2% or 3% of CIF investments, for example, are going into critical just transition policies like social protection or economic diversification. There has to be hardly anything, being invested on these social and economic justice parts of the transition. So flagging that gap and start pushing more concretely for those gaps to be funded in the future was part of the platform. And then, of course, open, and this I'm sure Carola will flag, open a real conversation about the structural barriers to the just transition. Whether we're talking about ISDS and investment rules, whether we're talking about trade and justice, whether we're talking about debt, there are severe hurdles in the way of the transition so that it's just. And we wanted to create that space. And the mechanism and the idea of creating this institutional vehicle that supports implementation, gives us a seat at the table, and at the same time opens a political conversation about the barriers was a key part of our package. I would really like, instead of me presenting you what we want, I think I would really like to invite folks to read that decision because I'm sure you are going to see more in it than probably what I can see in it or which all of us with our own biases can read. So I will then later put a little bit of put a link in the chat. What I would like to go back now is to the elements and the questions from FISA, in particular on what can be done about this at the community level to prevent gas from expanding. Because for us, there is one critical thing that can already be done, which is to mobilize this decision and all the rights and all the inclusion elements to accompany, I would say, to further legitimize the demands from movements on the ground to have a seat at the table and make the whole conversation about the transition a conversation about the governance of the transition that right now is being captured, we know, by powerful lobbies and by governments that indeed are facing structural barriers, but also have interest in perpetuating the status quo. So there is one important element about how we keep using decisions that are coming from the United Nations that in the past few years have become so weak that we don't even dare using them. But in this particular case, is the most ambitious, I think, at least of what I've seen coming from a climate governance space when it comes to inclusion and rights. So for me, there is first that potential and using that in the context of energy transition conversations and somehow dismantling the idea that there is an inherent contradiction between social prosperity and climate action. Because we know that in the conversation about gas, gas is being weaponized and social justice is being weaponized to advance an anti-climate approach. So we have there some elements that could be strengthened. I think there is a second aspect that I think can support communities, but needs to be picked up at the international level, and is really going into the MDB space. And how do we use this decision from the UNFCCC to challenge the super narrow, no ambitious, just transition principles that the banks have been using? And these are two elements. On the one side, going there, but also try, and I think this is going to be the work this year, in particular in terms of designing the BAM, the mechanism that we are hoping to get a final design and agreement at the end of next year, bringing them into that space. And it's challenging because on the one side, we don't really like them. And on the other side, we want them to be governed by these principles and by equity and by climate ambition. So this is going to be, I think, an interesting strategic conversation that both communities, the ones working on MDBs and the ones working at COP, but generally speaking, the ones working on the energy transition need to have to see how we crack that governance aspect, because we certainly need them in the tent, but under our principles, not just doing what they've been doing forever. And I think the third element is really about fighting for the rights mechanism also next year, and what that BAM, our BAM, looks like, but also what can we win at the COP, because we can have the most perfect ideas, but at some point there is a power struggle, there is a negotiation, and for us, trying to make something that, again, politically elevates the conversation on the barriers, supports the countries and territories and communities that want to make just transition happen, and gives, as much as possible, all these rights holders an equal seat at the table for discussing the energy transition, are going to be important fights for us. As I round up, Fiza, I think there is an acknowledgement that yes, the just transition decision doesn't explicitly refer to transitioning away or to gas. But one, there was a reference to transitional fuels that we managed to remove. So it's quite important also, in particular for the ones that were not there, to know that that pushback worked and that the transitional fuels was removed from the text. So, and I think that's like a little win that we can also own. And the second part is that our understanding, and I think it's really important in our narrative of what we want on just transition at the COP, is that we really emphasize that it is within the scope of the just transition, all the aspects of the energy transition. Because we need to shape that narrative of what this decision is about and what it is not. And the way in which we are reading it is, it says very clearly that it is about supporting 1.5. It says very clearly that this needs to support ambition. It says very clearly that it has to address all the aspects of the energy transition. Therefore, it is a way in which we handle, first, the transition away, but also preventing bad choices in terms of the future that lock countries into the wrong investments, as Omar was saying at the beginning. So my final point is that we need also to remember that the fight on just transition is not a UNFCCC fight. There are so many movements, so many communities, so many territories that are fighting for just transition in their own places with their own entry points, whether it's talking about water, whether they're talking about food, whether they're talking about industrial policy. And I think it's very important that we keep always our eyes and ears to the ground and ensure that what we are mobilizing globally is really reflecting the needs of many of those movements and groups that are fighting on the ground and how this international system can support them. So that will remain at the heart, I think, of what we're doing in the next few months and years. And yeah, we are, of course, excited and exhausted, both, about what was a pretty incredible year. I will stop there. Thank you, Fiza.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna, for your interventions. Very elaborative and strategic as well. So your emphasis on community agency is central to operationalizing the Belém commitments. And I agree that fighting for the rights is critical. So we are switching to our next and the last speaker. And I know, Anna, that you want to leave little earlier. So all the questions regarding just transition. So we will do it in part 2, and in our next sometime webinar, we will again inviting you to discuss it more, and definitely mean after a few months we will see and we will again review it, that now where we are standing and how we are going to connect this just transition debate with what the MDBs and the gas and fossil fuel financing is going on. Maybe after that April fossil fuel financing conference in Colombia we are hearing about, so around that we can have our another conversation around that. So thank you very much for your time and all this work, I must say. So we are switching to our last and the fourth speaker, Carola. First of all, Carola, thank you very much. You joined our panel during COP on gas and debt at Asia Climate Solutions Pavilion and made significant interventions. My today's question is that many vulnerable economies left COP30 is still facing intense pressure from gas expansion, often tied to debt and foreign financing. So, what lessons can we draw from countries already burdened by gas-related debt as we move forward without a global fossil phase-out roadmap? And what do you think that did COP30 mitigate or intensify financial incentives, pushing countries toward gas investments? So over to you, Carola.
Thank you so much, Fisa. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you so much. To start, I'd like just to give a brief explanation of what is for Latindad and for us a just, popular, and inclusive transition. It's 6 points. It should not promote the idea of energy as a commodity, but as a fundamental right for the people. It should not deepen extractivism in the global south. It should not undermine the right of the population to food sovereignty and water security. It should not deprive communities of their territory nor generate environmental and social impacts. It should not be reduced to changing the energy matrix from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, and it should not perpetuate or replicate the injustices of the current energy system. And as you were mentioning at the beginning, gas is a fossil fuel and should not be promoted as a clean energy solution. What I would like to say before going deeper into the climate finance analysis of the results, I would like to say that in COP30 we saw 1,600 lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry present, blocking the negotiations, doing everything to their favor, of course, partnering with the global north countries. But we also saw something very important. After 3 years of COPs, we found a COP that allowed more people to participate outside. We saw more than 70,000 people from indigenous communities, civil society, social movements, claiming climate justice and protesting and doing a lot of activism to demand a territory free of extractive activities, because these activities are really harming these people, and they were there. And even though there is no mention of fossil fuels in the final document of COP30, which is completely shameful, for the first time, 80 countries were really pushing for the inclusion of phasing out a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, and that is a very important political sign. And Brazil announced a fossil fuel roadmap, and there is also an announcement of a first international conference on the just transition away from fossil fuels that is going to happen next year in Santa Marta, Colombia in April. I think that is going to be an important political moment for us to push for these things and to push for gas and fossil fuels phase out. This international conference is being announced by Colombia and Holland, and we are going to be participating actively in that space. So, how much money do we need for this energy transition? It is estimated that globally we need $4.2 trillion per year, $1 trillion per year to be able to transit to clean energy by 2030, and 5 trillion annually thereafter by 2050. So where will the money come from? We saw, and Frederick was already mentioning, most of this money is coming through loans to our countries. But we need really grant-based or highly concessional public money in the recognition of the common but differentiated responsibilities. Global North countries are the most responsible for this climate emergency, and as Frederick was mentioning as well, they are trying to dilute this historical responsibility in these negotiations, and we see that every year, and this is a continuous thing. And they are not fulfilling their commitments. The new goal, as Frederick was mentioning, only 300 billion per year is insufficient considering the needs of 1.3 trillion per year to implement the NDCs, the national determined contributions in our countries in the global south. But it's not only about the quantity, but also the quality. There are very complex mechanisms to access this climate finance. For example, one project to be approved in the Green Climate Fund takes 5 years. So it is really not responding to the urgency or the emergency we are facing. There are very few direct access windows for non-governmental stakeholders, for indigenous communities, for the people in the front line of this emergency. There's no single methodology or definition to provide transparency in this climate finance. But as also Frederick was mentioning, 2/3 of climate finance are loans right now. And that is increasing the debt burden, which is already high in our countries. And this is completely unfair. Climate finance adding to our debt burdens is something that we are not really going to allow. And global north countries are making profit of it. They charge interest rates in these loans they give us. So at the end, we in the global south are the ones paying for a climate emergency that we have contributed really little. And right now we are facing a debt crisis. There are more than 60 countries highly indebted, many of them very vulnerable to climate change. And of course, this responds to a very unfair and neocolonial financial system ruled by global north countries, which are the real climate debtors. But they are the ones putting the rules, in their benefit and the benefits of their corporations. And as Annabella was saying, the debt crisis is one of the biggest structural barriers to climate action. There are countries, for example, in Latin America, like Colombia, which are spending 20% of their public budget to repay these debts annually, and less than 1% to really fund climate action or just transition. And something very, very concerning in our countries is that more debt implies greater pressure for investing in extractive industries. To guarantee this debt repayment and avoid default, global south countries are continuing investing in hydrocarbons, mining, agribusiness, deforestation as their primary source of income. For example, I'm from Bolivia. My country is dependent on gas exports. And right now we are highly indebted, so they are trying to search ways to keep investing in this gas sector to obtain the dollars we need to repay these debts, but also to grow and to develop as the false promise we have of extractivism. And that is creating a lot of environmental and social impacts and a lot of conflicts in our countries. And I come from a region which has the highest rate of murders, for example, of people that is defending their territory, going against these extractive activities and that are not being heard. And COP30 gave them an opportunity to be heard worldwide, but unfortunately, nothing is being done. But it's not only that countries choose to invest in these extractive sectors to repay their debts, but also the financial system, this unfair financial system, is pushing them into more debt and into more extractivism. Because, for example, if you get a loan from the IMF, as it happened with Argentina and other countries recently, they are conditioning this loan to you keep exploiting gas, for example, in Vaca Muerta Reserve in Argentina. In the case of Suriname, that had a huge debt, we saw that Eurobond holders, that are their creditors, have offered a debt restructuring, but with the condition of them exploiting fossil fuels and giving them royalties. And we also see the credit rating agencies, part of this unfair financial system, international financial system, pushing countries to more extractivism. Because what happened in Ecuador recently, a year ago, they had a popular consultation called the Yasuni, where people said no to fossil fuel extraction in a very important Amazon region. But what happened the next day, we saw Moody's threatening the Ecuadorian government, saying, if you respect that result, we are going to downgrade your rate. So that, of course, put them in a worse position. And in these negotiations, it's very frustrating how we always hear global countries saying that there's not enough public money, that we need to rely on the private sector, as Frederick was already mentioning. They say there's not enough public money, but we see just in 1 year, global military spending reached $2.7 trillion, going to wars, genocides. Global fossil fuel subsidies amounted $7 trillion in only 1 year, 2022, and maybe there is more updated data about it. So the public money is there, but it's going to places and sectors that are harming people instead of really helping. And that is something that we are trying to also show. And we are pushing for different proposals out there. For example, one important is to reform the current climate finance architecture, to leave neocolonial instruments behind and increasing the use of accessible and agile public grants with direct access windows for the communities and vulnerable groups to guarantee just transition, but also to adapt to this climate crisis. We are pushing for debt relief for countries in need. And this year is a very important year because it's the year of the Jubilee. This has been a campaign, a global campaign led by the church and civil society that 25 years ago had results. My country was benefited 20 years ago by a debt relief process because of this Jubilee. So we want debt relief, debt cancellation involving private and public creditors, but also MDBs, which are important creditors in our countries as well. And we want to say no to false solutions. We are publishing a lot of papers, evidence, reports showing how debt swaps are problematic, how blended finance is not going to solve the climate emergency if they don't receive profit from it, how market-based mechanisms are false solutions. For example, the the carbon markets and the TFFF, which was also very promoted in COP30. And we're also pushing for a reform in the international financial architecture that could lead to a more democratic and fair financial system. Frederick was already mentioned how, for example, MDB's governance is not fair. Countries like the United States have 14% of voting power in the World Bank, but countries like mine, 0.14%. So we have no voice in these institutions that are the ones supposed to be giving the solutions, giving the funding, but they are just increasing our debts and not really solving the problems. But we also were pushing, for example, in July this year in Sevilla, in June, sorry, for a UN sovereign debt convention as a multilateral space, more democratic space to solve the problems, because it is not something good that to have the Paris Club, the G20, the G7, the OECD countries trying to solve the debts when they are receiving profit from it, and they don't want to change the status quo. So we need a multilateral space where one country represents one vote, not $1, one vote. Then we need progressive taxation. Fossil fuel corporations should be paying as well. This is very linked to a process that is ongoing and that we are trying to influence as well, which is related to the establishment of a UN tax convention, where these principles of the polluter pays should be included as well as others, to tax the wealthy countries, the richest people in the world, which are also more responsible for the climate emergency, and to redirect these military expenditures and fossil fuel subsidies to climate action, because we need to do that urgently. We have seen 30 years of negotiations not leading to anything really concrete. We expected this COP to be different, to really focus in implementation, to really focus on fulfilling commitments related to climate finance. We wanted to discuss the public provision climate finance element, but at the end, they opened a process of 2 years, a work program that is going to talk about climate finance very broadly, with Article 9.1 referred to this provision by global north countries to global countries as a part of it, but it's not going to really solve anything, we think, from our perspective. And it is not a solidarity, charity that we're asking the North. It is about climate justice and reparations. So I will stop here, and I'll be very happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carola. Your insights really highlight why economic justice must remain central to the energy transition conversation. Frederica, would you like to comment right now on Victor's point on US influence in MDBs? Then we can take some questions, or, I mean.
Yes, so I'm gonna jump in to present my last slide, but a lot of it also connects to what speakers just said and to what Victor put in the chat around US influence on the MDBs or on the World Bank specifically. But yeah, a lot of the wider takeaways that I kind of took from COP are really relevant to that. And thanks, Carola, for this amazing presentation, which really connected, I think, also with kind of the last point I have here on the slide of a declaration from the People's Summit that was held at the same time as COP, which was a huge event, together with a massive march, tens of thousands of people, as Carola said, from the grassroots, from civil society were there, from indigenous peoples. And on the right here, I took a screenshot from a part of the People's Declaration that is mentioning, the IMF and the World Bank specifically is demanding that international climate finance does not go through institutions like that deepen inequality. So I really recommend everyone to read that declaration that touches on many important points regarding the financial architecture that we need in order to implement climate justice. But I think even though the IFIs were like less explicitly the center of attention this time than they were perhaps with the NCQG, the MDBs, were still there. They had their pavilion, some events, but they weren't really discussed as much, and the IMF was basically totally absent. Um, Despite that, finance is still kind of the major fault line that is undermining ambition everywhere, whether it's, talking about adaptation or about trade or like all of the different negotiation items, the NDCs, so many of the NDCs from global South countries are conditional on actually receiving the finance to implement them. And so that is kind of hounding the discussions everywhere. And we could see that all other aspects of the financial architecture are bleeding into those negotiation spaces. Countries are very aware how the trade architecture impacts their ability to implement climate action, how debt and tax and the cost of capital is limiting them. So those things did show up in different spaces. And so we can see those connections are starting to be made. And so even though like the MDBs, were more low key this time, they are still mentioned in the cover decision text in the Mutirao. And I think it's important to note that given that global North countries are refusing to budge on finance provision, that's kind of the implicit solution. And we saw that in this other quote that I grabbed here, which was an interview that the COP president Delago gave kind of in the middle of the event, saying, you don't need more money. We don't actually need more money, public money from developed countries. We just need to leverage it better, right? So even the COP president was kind of harping on the same narrative of kind of de-risking, right, that the MDBs are promoting. And so that's a point that connects to what Annabella said of this challenge of bringing in the MDBs to the conversation. Like, yes, we need we want signals out of the UNFCCC, out of whether it's the just transition mechanism or the 2.1c discussions of like, what do we need from the MDBs in order to like be properly Paris aligned, right? But then they also have this epistemic hegemony of this de-risking discourse that is so like present and rooted in all finance discussions in all development spaces, that it's really dangerous as well, right? To bring them in, without having first a very clear framework of sort of directionality of what is it that we need from them. Because otherwise you obviously run the risk, and that's also an issue with 2.1c and this like high level forum that they're putting up now, right? If you're not directional, you run the risk that they come in and just like keep promoting their own agenda and their own narrative. So that's a big danger. And to Victor's point, one of the things that I think is very visible also happened at F50 in Sevilla, but here again, because there's this multilateral deadlock, we're seeing a lot more shift into action agendas and roadmaps and dialogues and coalitions of the willing. So it's kind of like, okay, if we cannot get it done consensus-based, can we get things done like in smaller groups of countries or in different initiatives? And I think that speaks to your point, Victor, of Trump and the US administration. I mean, they hold sway at least over the World Bank and the IMF, which are obviously the biggest IFIs. They are not the majority shareholders in all of the MDBs. And so there's, I think, a point to be made around, holding the line on the Bretton Woods institution specifically, but there might be more room outside of this like very specific geopolitical agenda of the US to advance things with other MDBs, or also just like with other types of spaces and institutions specifically. And that's why I'm mentioning this coalitions of the willing thing, because I think, for example, this fossil fuel initiative that Colombia put up is a really good example of that, where, I think there's pros and cons to that, right? The cons are everybody can just do whatever they want, and if nothing is under the sort of umbrella of the UNFCCC anymore, like it will fall apart. But then it also means countries can actually take the initiative and say, you know what, you big guys, whether the US or Saudi Arabia or who else, you don't want to budge on something that is really important to us, like fossil fuels. We're just gonna forge ahead with the people that want to do something about it. And so that might, I think, is also one of the results of this kind of geopolitical situation that we're seeing that, okay, if if the US and some of these other players, don't want progress and want to pretend that climate change isn't real, okay, so be it. Of course, they are still important and have impacts, but can we get things done anyway, even if they're not there?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for these important interventions. So, friends, we are opening the floor and shall we take Carola, you want to jump in? Yeah, please quickly, then we will open the floor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe on this point on the US and climate finance, not only the influence of the US in MDBs, but as you know, Trump has withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement, and that's going to be a real fact next year. And that is very concerning because the United States is the country with the biggest pollution, is the country that should be giving more money to climate finance, and that is going to be a risk because climate finance is really going down. Public climate finance is really going down. And after this announcement of the United States, many European countries also announced the reduction of climate finance because they were going to invest this money in the defense sector, military expenditure. So that is very risky regarding this climate agenda because without money, we cannot advance anything in mitigation, in adaptation, in just transition. And that is something we need to think about. And yeah, if you want, we can go to the questions and then I can intervene again.
Thank you. Thank you, Carola. So we have now 4 interventions, 2 in the chat, but I will really, if they are still there, I will ask them if they can just unmute their mic and come in. Georgi Delos, if I'm pronouncing correct, from Greenpeace, and then Habiba Fad from Menafem, and then Ellison, and then Sebastian. So if Georgi Delos, Greenpeace, if you are here, please come in and yeah, please.
Yes, thank you so much. No, basically my question is that now we seem to be at the end of like a long interest rate cut cycle, which except the US maybe, but in many big economies. So, and basically interest rates may stay, remain where they are or even start growing next year, which is affecting us negatively in many ways. So basically, even less favorable circumstances. I just wonder if there's anything we can do in this specific. We know what's going to happen in the market, more or less, in that sense, at least the direction. Is there anything extra we can do under these circumstances? Or yeah. So would love to hear your insights on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Let us take all the questions, all the 4 questions first in this first round, and then we will ask our speakers. Habiba, can you come in?
Hello, yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was super interesting to listen to. My question is more about the new kind of economic system that we're pushing for in the just transition conversations. I'm from Egypt, and a lot of the investments that are happening within the MENA region in renewable energy are also still focused on like exporting before like decarbonizing like the local like national grid, whether that's like actually through like electricity cables that will be built to Cyprus and Greece and then towards Europe, or even in industrialization like green like using green hydrogen to make like green aluminum or fertilizers, etc., which are all majority are for exports. So I was just wondering, like, if someone, because I wasn't able to make it to COP, so I was wondering if that's something that took a bit of space in the negotiations for the just transition of like how to ensure that even within what's being paid in climate finance, it's not only for the interests of like global north countries. In the case of the MENA region, it's Europe, but I'm sure in other parts of the world as well.
Okay, thank you, Habiba. Thank you. Ellison, please come in.
Habiba, you let me do a plug for the Big Shift Global Just Transition to Renewable Energy Working Group. And that's, if you look at the strategy for next year, that sort of profiteering, the multilateral banks investing in profiteering that you've just described is a core part of that. The concerns that hopefully that will take forward as Big Shift Global in that space. I'd be interested to hear if it was also discussed at COP. I had a comment on the governance and actually the BAM, the pros and cons of the MDBs being in the BAM. My concern is that the MDBs they do their own self-assessment. They have their own Paris alignment. They say if they're Paris aligned or not. And we all know it's not, and similarly with the UN Secretary General's mineral panel reports, they all say that they apply them. They have their performance standards. And of course, we have inclusion in that performance standard. And we know that it is a tick box exercise. Yeah, we talked to a few locals, that's done our job. But they do a self-assessment. So for justice transition, they could set up their new indicators and again do their nice little tick box and say, yes, we're doing just transition. Aren't we good? So with the BAM, if it's set up well, it could be a way of holding them to account and saying, actually, no, you're not doing it right. Where are the unions in that space? Where are the communities that are affected? So, I mean, that is if it's set up well. If they're given the Just Transition Fund, they will just give it to their friends and then their allies. So that's really something we don't want. But if it is viewed as some way to hold them accountable for delivery of just transition in all their climate finance, and then it could be right. So I think it would be really great if Big Shift Global can keep in that space, keep an eye in that space in terms of that accountability of climate finance through the multilateral banks and just see it as another accountability route.
Thank you, Alison, for this question. And Sebastian, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Great presentation today. I learned a lot. And two things regarding the US, more than Trump is Congress. Most of the funds for multilateral development banks and financial institutions come from Congress. And they have changed lots of their bills around the year. Last time we tried to support some efforts from some Democrats on preserving some of the funds for the World Bank, and it did work. So there is also a potential that we can collaborate with people in the Congress, and there is a coalition that does that work locally. But of course, majority of the Congress in the US is Republican, so it's like swimming in a pool of blue, quite hard. The other point I have is regarding the upcoming annual meetings for the MDBs. So all of this information is great, and I would like to find a way for me and our teams to plan on how to implement and take actions during, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank annual meetings coming up in March, then spring meetings in April, then AFDB, ADB, EBRD, among others. So how we translate all of this great content into a plan for all of us to collaborate and implement in the upcoming meetings. And thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you very much. So over the speakers or even anyone from the participants, if they really want to respond any of the questions. So, I mean, we are really opening this discussion in a way. So yes, the responses. Who would like to respond on the Georgis Delos first question?
Yes, maybe I can go and respond that. Yeah, the increase in interest rates is going to affect us, of course, because most of our loans are in dollars, US dollars, and that is going to increase these debts. That is going to be a problem. But something that we are trying to push and maybe what is happening at the geopolitical level is important, is the emerge of this stronger, for example, BRICS bloc, that is also promoting to give loans in different currency. So in that way, we don't have that strong dependency only on the US dollars, and that is something important. But we also need to understand that, the interest rate is also related to the climate vulnerability of countries. And there are a lot of studies showing that the higher the climate vulnerability of a country, the higher the interest rate they charge you. This is completely unfair. And we need to keep putting this evidence out there, narratives, demand proposals, so this is not going to affect us that much. And I think also keep pushing for an UN debt convention is going to be a space where these kind of things could be discussed as well as, for example, the role of these credit agencies, rating agencies, which are independent and respond to the interests of the North, of the global North, for example. And the other questions, I didn't really follow closely the just transition negotiations, but I think, yeah, what we are trying to do in the Global South is push for climate finance that is not going to increase the levels also for the just transition process. So in this BAM mechanism, I think we need to really strategize how to include also the financial component there, because it talks about international cooperation and it has good basis and principles so far. So we need to keep pushing for grant-based, highly concessional funding. And if we talk about MDBs, and I think Frederick is going to expand on this, yeah, we need to show that these MDBs are mostly giving loans and not and we have analyzed these loans and they are mostly non-concessional loans, so with not real conditions. So this has to change if they really want to help us uh, to move forward to a just transition process, adaptation, climate action. This money needs to be with different conditions. And I think we need to do this kind of strategies and narratives towards what Sebastian was mentioning, next year, annual meetings, and all the processes that are going to happen, yeah, next year.
Thank you, Carola. So, Frederick or Uma, anyone?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a few small points. I'm not sure I have all the answers, but just to react to Georg's point around central banks, what Carola said, but also there's actually very little advocacy happening around central banks. We did that a bit last year. So I just want to flag that as well. There's, interesting work to be done around green central banking and the role that we need, central banks to play in a green transition. They are always a sort of technocratic, undemocratic, independent, right? Central bank independence is one of the big mantras kind of that no one really questions. And it's also very technical work. But just to say, there is a coalition of finance ministers on climate action hosted at the World Bank, unfortunately. And then there's the NGFS, like the Network for Greening the Financial System, and they have started collaborating more as well this year. So if anyone's interested in, doing some advocacy there, and I recommend it, or feel free to reach out. On the just transition piece that Habiba raised, like I think that's exactly, I'm glad Alison is here representing, the Banking on Renewables campaign. I think that's like exactly at the heart of a lot of the advocacy that we're doing as well with MDBs, and kind of around the renewable energy piece, that we don't want, that to just be reproducing the same exploitative patterns, and kind of for that to be done in a way that doesn't benefit local communities and that just creates new sacrifice zones, etc. Right? So we, as Recourse, call it sort of sustainable renewables, to emphasize that the importance of community access, of ensuring that even if you do a large scale project, obviously beyond not, land grabbing and things like that, but that you also ensure it's actually done in a way that focuses on energy sovereignty first, rather than just creating like another project that's focused on energy exports and kind of foreign investors. So yeah, that's a challenge, and I think that has to be like really emphasized in our advocacy as well, to prevent that from happening. And then yeah, last point to what Sebastian said on the different annual meetings, spring meetings, etc. Yeah, I think it's also worth thinking about what else is happening, outside of these recurrent meetings, in like, given the geopolitical situation, looking for where spaces are less closed. I know, it is it's like swimming in glue, like you described it, Sebastian, but where are there other spaces where South-South solidarity is happening? Carola, described what's going on under the BRICS. We have this Colombia initiative around fossil fuels, others, around tax that are led by different groups and regions of global south countries. So basically starting to look into spaces that are delinking from this very global north centric financial architecture. And is that something we can like amplify and support while holding the line in these like
Yeah, thank you.
colonial spaces?
Thank you, Frederique. Thank you very much. And sorry if we are running short of time, and we are almost up to our time. And so maybe we have not responded all the questions, and maybe there will be other more questions, but definitely, this is not the only webinar. This is what the series of webinar, and definitely we will keep engaging all of you in this discussion and discourse. So with this note, so I'm thanking you, all our panelists and participants. So today's discussion made it clear that the post-COP period must move beyond declarations. So we need decisive action that prioritizes justice, accelerates renewable solutions, and actively dismantle the financial and political structures that keep fossil gas entrenched, in fact. And with this note, I'm inviting Sophie Richmond to share concluding reflections, and I would also request her if she can also respond to the Allison's question on the big shifts related work. So over to you, Sophie.
Thanks. I recognise that we really don't have very much time, so I'm just going to be super quick. And also, I think that all of the speakers have really spoken comprehensively about this, and it's kind of a hard act to follow. But I feel like Sebastian's question about where we take this next is the kind of right place to leave this webinar. And I think it's definitely given us a to-do list for 2026. Some of the things like dismantling the idea of social prosperity versus just transition is maybe not something that has a quick fix. But I do think, we shouldn't forget, as Anna said, that fossil fuel phase out is implicit in the just transition outcome, and there are ways to use some of these levers now against or towards the MDBs, and also to hold their shareholding governments to account as well. And I think also Carola really highlighted that importance of making connections with the bigger economic justice fights. All of this is linked to tax, and it is linked to debt, and it is linked to this push to public finance for just transition. And I think that's something that we should definitely look at in our work for next year. And also, one thing that I did just want to highlight as well is when we are facing all of these challenges in the structure, we should also not forget about the wins that there are at a national level and people power. When many of us were at COP, we did see the win on the Batangas LNG terminal in Philippines. So I think all of that work and people power really contributes to momentum. And I think in terms of gas specifically, I think on the Just Transition Working Group, there's a lot of work to be done across both of these working groups at Big Shift, and hopefully we can shape that in the coming weeks. But I think on gas, as Omar rightly put it, we really need to challenge this idea of gas being kind of being used, or the lack of political will for stopping gas, and really need to open people's eyes to see why gas is a dead end. And I think some of this work with where there's wins at the local level can also support that. I think it's really hard to sum all of this up, and but I think it was really useful as a kind of signpost of where we do need to go next year. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And thank you once again to our speakers, Umar, Frederique, Anna, Carola, and all attendees. The insights shared today will feed directly into ongoing advocacy, campaign coordination, and collaborative efforts across our networks. So we encourage you to stay connected, continue these conversations, and join us in pushing for a just, equitable transition before 2030. So session is now formally closed. Take very good care of yourselves.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.